Good evening, Laudetur Jesus. Good evening to my guests as well, Sir Charles KRALJ and Sir Timom Zakoškom. Hello.
Good evening to you all.
So, tonight's show called Crux is international, and we'll be discussing monarchy. The topic of the day is democracy is dead, what now? And we're referring especially to the whole thing that's happening in the United States regarding the voting fraud and stuff like that, and also in some aspects the collapse of political system in Europe, because obviously we can see that that democracy is not providing the fruits needed. I mean, we do have peace, but is that all? We also have obese youngsters. We have a lot of different other diseases and problems in the society that needs to be answered. And I think democracy is the barricade, something that's preventing us to solve those problems. So maybe just a few words first from Sir Charles regarding the position on monarchy in general.
Well, firstly, these days, whenever you mention monarchy, people immediately think of despotism. If they're Catholic and they're English speaking, they'll think of Henry VIII. They somehow magically forget all of the Catholic kings of England. They go right out the memory hole. Henry VIII was apparently the only king England ever had. In America, immediately they'll start talking about the revolution, and people will say freedom this and freedom that. Well, there are a lot of problems with that basic approach. The first is that we're all under lockdown right now, and in a lockdown that, regardless of its justification or not, would not have been tolerated by our ancestors. We're not perhaps the best judges of what freedom really is. The elections in my country, of course, whether there's been massive fraud or not, which is the whole other issue, the whole question of the system has been called, the whole system has been called into question, is what I'm trying to say. The fact is that in America, we once spoke of the sanctity of the ballot box with a straight face. And that is something I don't think anyone can say anymore. So that's very, very problematic. In looking at all of these things, too, people today identify the ability to vote with free government. And that's, of course, not always the case. Under communism, not only could you vote, you had to vote, but it didn't mean it affected anything. Or as Stalin said, let people vote for whom they choose, just let me choose whom they vote for. So we're in a very, very strange time. We're in a very transitional time where I think a lot of old ideas have to be re-examined, both for good and for ill. And I think that monarchy is an idea whose time perhaps is coming back. But again, that depends on how you define it. You know, monarchy means a lot of things to a lot of people, just as republics do. Nazi Germany was a good republic with an elected leader, you bet. But that's not generally what people have in mind when they talk about republics. Similarly, when I speak of monarchy anyway, I speak of Christian and particularly Catholic monarchy. So we can let off the Manchu emperor, the Ottoman Sultan, all those guys who personally I wouldn't have wanted to live under. Although, even with them, you'll find that when they're gotten rid of, they've never been replaced by anything better.
Well, I think today, and our the guests that will be watching the show, I think they know that we'll be talking about Catholic monarchy, and especially the options how to implement one in modern society. But before we go to that, Tim, I think the word should be yours now.
Well, thank you ever so much again. Good evening to you all. Yes, as Mr. Charles said, today when one says monarchy, a lot of people think of something from the Middle Ages or something which is not adapted to our modern culture and civilization. But that is quite an error in a way of thinking. Because we have so many different types of government today, and monarchy is one of them. I will probably going to repeat myself with this particular statement, but St. Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor, when he was talking about the ways and the different types of government, he said there's no perfect type of government. There's no perfect thing in this world because we are all mortal, we are all sinners, etc. But the government which is closer to perfection is a monarchy. Why? Simply because it is a reflection of the divine society, of the heavenly structure, which is shown and used for our human nature, for our best use. So according to St. Thomas Aquinas, who wasn't a stupid person, far from that, the monarchy is one of the best ways to govern people. And I must agree with St. Thomas. And then, of course, we are living in a 21st century, and especially this year was rather a special one. So we can see different crises, not only in Europe, but all around the globe, which are showing that our current system is rather frail. It's not very strong. And now we see all those holes that our leaders tried to cover during last years, even last few decades. And that is a huge problem. So yes, although the monarchy in the ear of a normal, I wouldn't say simple, but someone who is less interested in politics or history or something like that, monarchy sounds something extremely abstract. If you do not live in England or in Belgium or any other monarchies in Europe or around the globe, you would never consider that the monarchy is a possible way for your country. For example, many Slovenians, who I hope are as well watching this video, would never think of Slovenia as monarchy, although that's not impossible. And I have many plans to work on Slovenia as some sort of monarchy, if not a monarchy per se, but at least as monarchy in its principle, in its way of governing things. And that's extremely important. When we're going to talk a bit more about democracy, we're going to see all those problems which can be taken away by a different type of governing, like monarchy. And I wouldn't say, like for example, one of the oldest democracies in Europe, which is still one of the example par excellence of democracy, is Great Britain. And that's funny, but Great Britain is a monarchy since an extremely long period of time. So all the international lawyers and other eminent people are saying that the British system is the most democratical and the most ancient system in Europe that exists. So it's important that we have a look on that subject as well, that democracy and monarchy can work together, you see. So they're not opposite things, but they can work extremely well together.
Well, okay. Maybe we'll disagree on some topics. For interest, I'm completely against democracy in any form. But maybe if we start the debate with what democracy actually is, and from my point of view, I see the major negative point of democracy in negative selection, especially, and I got into quite some trouble for saying that on Twitter. It was, I think, about half a year ago or something like that, when I said universal suffrage was a grave mistake, and the women's voting right was especially the gravest mistake of them all. And I think that at that point the collapse of democracy began, because the pool of voters get from this big, and from really, men, we're mostly involved into politics either in our homes when we have to make discussions with our wives and other people living in our home and stuff like that, or in local area and stuff like that, and we are following what's happening around the world and in our society, whereas women don't do that much. So there was a pool of voters, men, that kind of knew what they were doing when they were giving votes. But it's interesting that with the collapse of monarchies and the rise of democracy, they figured that only votes from men wouldn't be enough. We need also votes from women. And when they got votes from women, they got this very sensible voters, which you can easily persuade with honey words and stuff like that. And that completely destroys everything what politics is. I mean, politics is honey words, but you have to also have actions. And when you have just honey words, that's what we have today. So this is nowadays democracy. Sweet words, nice promises, but nothing tangible, And that's my major concern about democracy, the negative selection. So the people that get most votes are the worst ones usually, because they give promises and stuff like that. And it's interesting, it's kind of a Catholic thing that those in politics that preach the truths, that they are talking about real problems in society, usually get least votes. So that would be just my bone I threw, and now I leave it all up to you, gentlemen.
It certainly is important too, I think, to define what we mean by democracy.
Yes.
Because like all the other words, monarchy, republic, et cetera, they tend to dodge proper definition, and people mean very different things by them. In the 70s, when I was in college, we said that in the United States, in the West, we have representative democracy. The Soviets claimed to have people's democracy. Idi Amin defined cannibalism as nutritional democracy. So, yeah, we really do have to define these things. But the points you make are certainly valid so far as they go. But I would add something to them, and that is that it is the nature of modern governance to expand the franchise almost as a means of diminishing their responsibility. Now, I'll explain to you what I mean by that. We'll take England as an example. Now, 200 years ago, all the English towns were governed very much like the city of London, the square mile in the center of London is today. It's the only town in all of England that still has its medieval constitution. Now, they were basically run by little oligarchies, guildsmen, freemen, who had an incredible variety of names for their different titles. Mayor, rector, sovereign, some of them. Each town was quite different from another. But even today, in a lot of the British towns and villages, you'll still call the city hall the guild hall, because it was the guildsmen basically who chose who was going to be running the show. If you were not a guildsman or a freeman, you had no voice. You just had to do what you were given, but you knew where power lay. So you could riot, you could cajole, you could, I don't know, kiss feet, do whatever you needed to get what you needed done because you knew where power lay. Now, from the 1830s on, through a succession of reforms of local government in England, they had similar things in Scotland and Ireland at different times. The franchise for local positions was expanded until finally it was universal suffrage as it is today. But at the same time, the powers were successively taken away from municipal administrations and focused in Whitehall. So that, yes, you could vote for the mayor, you could vote for the city council, but they don't have a great deal of power, even though you could vote for them. And this was brought home to me about a year ago when I was in Cambridge, and they were getting ready to have a huge strike that was going to lock down the city and the university for 5 days. So I asked someone, well, can't the mayor call out the police? Can't something be done? No. It's all in the hands of the local MP, and she's approved it. Well, what sort of madness is that? Basically, that MP and those demonstrators, rioters, whatever you want to call them, they had more control over the city and University of Cambridge for those several days than the voters and taxpayers of Cambridge. Oh, but everyone could vote. Everyone could vote. Oh, okay. All right. That's good. We're in this country here in Austria, a place I love, by the way. We're about to go into 24-hour curfew. I don't recall that being voted on. So when you talk about democracy, I asked some years ago an elderly Austrian back in the States if he was a Republican or a Democrat. And he said, well, I can't very well be a Republican because I'm a monarchist. And I cannot be a Democrat because I do not believe in democracy. And I said, are you against democracy? He said, oh, certainly not, but I'm not against the tooth fairy either. I think, we do have to have a certain amount of reality injected into this issue. We really do. I have a friend who's Belgian, Christophe Chausal, who wrote a book called in English, The End of Democracy. It's also available in French, in which he goes into great detail about this sort of thing. And, I think part of the problem that people don't understand is the basic nature of societies in general. Every human society has rulers and ruled. The rulers are always a minority. The ruled are always a majority. And there's a established church, a state religion, an animating philosophy that dominates the place. We may not be religious. In the Soviet Union, the communist bloc, it was communism. That was the state church. There is no God, and Lenin is his prophet, if you like. But that is something that our democracy conceals. And because it conceals it, that governing class become totally irresponsible. I mean that in both terms, both the idea of political science having responsible government and also the popular term of being irresponsible, as in giving a 16-year-old money, booze, and a shotgun. We're ruled by people who are that irresponsible in that sense as well. So when we talk about democracy, people tend to think of it as everybody having a right to be heard, to influence things. But in truth, I don't think such a society has ever existed. You can pretend, but again, we're living at a time when the reality has been brought home to us by our elected governments. but they are gone on and on. And if somebody doesn't cut in quickly, I'll keep going. That's the problem with being a lecturer. You just keep going.
But sorry if I may interrupt. Isn't
Please.
democracy giving us the impression that we have the influence on politics and what's happening in the hierarchy? I think that's the main delusion of democracy. Because as you stated, in each society you have rulers and you have those who are ruled. And I think in former societies, how should I put that it wouldn't be heard too harsh? I don't know. I'm just gonna say it. People knew their places. If you were a peasant, you know you are a peasant. I'm not trying to say that you couldn't achieve more, be more. But if you were a peasant, you know what your rights are. You know what your boundaries are. If you were a craftsman, you know the same things. If you were a merchant, if you were I don't know, a baron and stuff like that. And even the king knew what were his boundaries, what were his responsibilities and stuff like that. But in democracy, I think everybody has an impression, and mostly in today's society of modern technology, everybody thinks they are movie stars. I don't know. I think I'm a TV show host, very good and very famous and stuff like that. I mean, we have impressions that aren't real. And I think that's the same thing is happening on the level of politics. So people think they have some influence by voting. But when we can see in the case of your country, of the United States, whereas, I mean, it doesn't work. It failed.
Well,
right now.
It has. Well, and the other thing too to bear in mind now, as Tim said, and I think quite rightly, I prefer the medieval, or if you will, Thomistic monarchy, the mixed sort of monarchy that St. Thomas spoke of. But even the absolute monarchies of the past, and we can drag out Henry VIII now, Louis XIV, none of them had the power over their subjects that the modern state has over its. And this is a very, very important thing to understand. Henry VIII had to somehow pretend he was within the law. He could have his wives executed after a form of trial. What he couldn't do is legalize polygamy. He couldn't change marriage. He couldn't decide he wanted to marry a guy. He didn't have that power. Similarly, you could not redefine what a human being was. And if you bring up the abortion issue, I tell you that our ancestors would have looked at us as bloody-handed savages, which we are, but we're nice, so it's okay. As long as you're nice, you know, everything's all right. But it's important to realize that we have already swallowed an absolute democracy. So when people chitter about monarchy and democracy, again, we're not in a position to judge these things all that well, considering what we've already gone along with. So when I hear people say things to me like, oh, well, under a monarchy, there's no freedom. Excuse me? Pardon me? Which monarchy were you speaking of? And to be honest with you, when you look at the monarchies of Europe, Britain, Scandinavia, Benelux, Spain, their strengths are to the degree that they remain somewhat monarchical, but their weaknesses are precisely the same as all the other quote unquote democracies. And that is to say that the voice of the political class is considered to be the voice of the people, which it is not. You know, inevitably in all those remaining constitutional monarchies, if yet another prerogative is taken away from the crown and given to the politicians, this is spoken of as a victory for democracy. No, it's not. It just means that the king or the queen has one less ability to protect his people. You know, Franz Joseph, the penultimate emperor of Austria-Hungary, and Duke of Carniola for our Slovene friends. He made the point when Teddy Roosevelt, former president of the United States, asked him, what do you think your role as a modern monarch should be? He said, and I think it's a very important thing to say, protecting my people from their politicians. And that, first and foremost, needs to be the role of a modern monarch, in my humble opinion.
And nobody does that today.
No. Well, when they do, you don't see it. It's done in such a way as to prevent the politicians from being embarrassed. So a very famous case back in 1965, Rhodesia declared unilaterally declared independence. And Harold Wilson, who was then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, intended to invade Rhodesia to put down the government, to put down the independence. The Queen talked him out of it. Because she said quite rightly, you may send that order, but we can't rely on the armed forces to carry it out. Because they had in very recent conflicts fought alongside the Rhodesians in Korea and World War II and the Berlin Airlift and so forth. So she was able to talk him out of what could have been a major catastrophe. But it's only been with the passage of decades and, shall we say, a bit of lack of discretion that comes out. Nobody knew about it at the time. So it would be, I think it would be incorrect to say that modern monarchies don't do anything, but they're not seen to do anything.
I would like to add some things here. I totally agree with Charles here. So when I was preparing for tonight's evening, I had a look in my classes of the constitutional law from last year when we talked about democracy. So the definition which was given to us was the one, or it was more a quote made by President Lincoln, saying democracy is the power of the people, by the people, for the people, which is all nice and beautiful and charming and perfect, etc. But yes, per se, by itself, it is a thing. But in reality, it's completely different. Because a definition is one thing, and then the reality is other thing. And now I'm going to quote Konstantin Pobedonostso, who was the conservative advisor of Russian Tsar, who I believe I quoted already last time, who said democracy is the greatest lie of our time. That was at the very end of the 19th century. And that thing, that quote, can be used in the 20th century or the 21st century. So it is something extremely universal and transcendent. And then, of course, when we're talking about the government, what is to govern? The French say, gouverner, c'est prévoir. As in English we will say, to govern is to predict. No. So if one would like to govern, one has to have a look what his actions are going to bear in the future. So we should not govern for the moment, but our actions at this very moment should be as well useful and beneficial for the future. And that's the problem we are seeing here. Because in many democratic states, since we have elections or the presidents who rules for 5 or 7 years, for 2 mandates perhaps sometimes, and we have different styles. We have perhaps 2 houses, the lower and upper house, or we have different types of government, or we have different styles. So you have the people who have perhaps not a lot of experience with governing. I wouldn't say they don't have a lot of experience with politics, because politics and government is not the same thing. One can have an extremely lot of experience with politics, but absolutely no experience by governing the people. And so we have people who are there because they are brilliant politicians, or at least they know how to persuade people, or know how to bribe people to obtain their position, which we should not ignore the fact that the fraught things can happen, and we are now probably experiencing that very thing, especially in the United States of America. One would never believe that such a large-scale fraud would be possible in a democratical country per excellence in the 21st century. One would never imagine that. And now we are facing that. In our daily lives, you're facing that cruel reality of corruption and fraud. And we have to bear that in our minds. So yes, we have the people, the politicians, who obtain certain crucial positions in the government, and they are not able and capable of governing, firstly themselves, and then of course, if you're not capable to govern yourself, if you don't have a certain routine, you don't have if you do not know yourself, if you don't know your pros and cons, etc., you would not be a good leader, because you do not know your own limits. And if you don't accept your own limits, and if you don't have a circle of trusted people who can help you with govern, that's a complete fail. So I think that's the problem as well, since in all of the democratical governments, you have 5 or 7 years for the president or prime minister, depends of the country, and 5 or 7 years is fair. It's far from sufficient amount of time to make something good for prosperity of your own country or the people you have to govern, and that's the thing.
Yeah, I think.
Yes.
On this point, when you were saying, you have to have a vision and stuff like that, I'm hearing myself, Tim, from you.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, I think just a second. Maybe this will be better. Yeah. So I was trying to say that by having a vision, you need to have at least a longer period of time that you're elected. So time you have to govern. For instance, in Slovenia, we have 4 years. And what basically people or politicians in democratic systems are doing, those 4 years are populist policies that ensure them as many votes as possible for the next election.
Exactly.
I think that's the main problem with the system in that part. And the other part is the etatism that destroys the tax system via completely, how should I say, wrong concept of military. Just today, I was researching Landsknechts, and I stumbled upon the system that was in 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century regarding the military, the inscription system, I think it was called. Every male at that time knew how to fight and had a weapon at home, or they just took it when they were summoned for war. But the taxes for military were raised only when the war was waged, and when there was peace, there was no taxes for war, for military and stuff like that. And so that's one thing. When we go along the chain, we get the taxes and stuff like so. Etatism, taxes, military, and what I said before, the gathering of the votes instead of being a ruler.
Well, you see, that's the thing. I mean, a president spends half his time learning his new job and half the time trying to get reelected.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing too, though, is that there have been two other major examples, possibly, of fraud in my country's electoral history. The first was the very day I was born, I'll have you know, when John F. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon. There was a great deal of evidence to show that the dead had risen to vote in sufficient numbers.
That wasn't in 1975.
No, 1960.
It was a joke.
Oh yeah, I got it. I wish I were that young, but it's not true.
I'm sorry to interrupt, gentlemen. Obviously, all the great men have birthday in autumn or in fall. So you two guys were the recent ones, and tried to congratulate you. I had mine in October, but cheers to you guys.
Well, there's nothing quite like the autumn leaves.
Sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
Not at all. So the thing is that it looked very much as though the dead had risen to vote for JFK in Illinois and in Texas, when President Nixon, and thus carried the states for Kennedy. President Nixon was shown the evidence and asked by his advisors if he wanted to dispute the outcome. And he said no, because the amount of damage that a Kennedy administration could do to this country is much less than calling into question the entire system. That was 1960. 40 years later, 2000, we had the famous hanging chads in Florida, which ended up with the Supreme Court deciding the outcome of the election. That was a very traumatic moment. What we're going through now is horrendous, because whatever happens, the unlikely event that Trump is able to retain the presidency, or that Harris does enter the White House, not Harris, her running mate. I keep forgetting who he is. At any rate, the likelihood that they'll take over, however it works out, a huge chunk of the population will be completely disaffected from the president of the United States, being assured that the whole thing's a fraud. And that is very dangerous.
And it goes in both ways.
And of course, the amount, yes.
Either scenario.
It goes both ways. Either scenario, we'll see half the population, more or less, thinking that the whole thing's a fraud. Now, what would make it more dangerous, in a sense, let's put it this way. This past summer, my country has witnessed a great deal of unprecedented civil unrest, the destruction of statues, horrendous and horrific things. And that is the lot that look to be about to gain power. Should that happen, the resistance to them could be very pronounced. And I honestly worry that the next few years will give us anything from the sort of ongoing civil unrest that Weimar Germany went through to outright civil war. And because you see, you have two very different factions who have nothing in common. Our two prior civil wars, the two sides did have a lot in common. Common morality, common view of things. That's how they were able to manage after the Second Civil War to reconcile so quickly and relatively completely. My earliest memories are the closing years of our centennial of the Second Civil War. And everyone was saying, bravery on both sides, isn't it wonderful, we're all Americans again. Now, all those wounds have been ripped wide open. It's not nice. And of course, what makes this sort of ironic from the standpoint of what we're discussing tonight is that the example of the United States has always really been the biggest argument of the non-communist Republican in monarchical countries. I mean, they could talk theory, they could talk freedom, they could talk this or that, but at the end of the day, it was look at the United States. They're a republic and they're great because they're a republic. Now, of course, that's actually historically arguable, to say the least. But nevertheless, that was how people felt. And it was certainly the case in places like Australia and Canada and New Zealand, where they would say, well, you know, we should be a republic of our own, then we'll be a big country like the States. Kind of cargo cult politics. You know, build a republic and we'll be great. Well, it's not how it works. To see the country going through what it's going through now is something that should make European monarchists, certainly, especially in republics, think very, very carefully, re-examine very carefully the whole issue. You know, if I may say this, part of the problems with European monarchism is that it's been for very long a sentiment rather than a cause. And that has really, for the sake of the nations of Europe, that has really got to change.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, if I may jump in, because I think that what we're discussing now, from my point of view, is the lack of willingness to do something. And I think we were raised like that. We were actually cultivated into what we are today. Especially, I'm referring to we as men, to be comfortable, to try not to get into too many disputes and stuff. And it's happening all along the spectrum, and we can see that with today's monarchs. And nobody is capable of seeing to have a insight in times that we are now, and to have a vision, as Tim stated before, and have the guts to do something. Now, if I go into like this imaginary scenario, and sir, we already discussed about this topic, and I put it on the table, and I put it on the table when I was discussing this with E. Michael Jones just the other day. I said, and I'll try to put it in broader spectrum now. The Trump family is a dynasty. They're strong, they're wealthy. Trump has half of the population for support, and they could easily figure out the times, what's going on. I think the civil war or some other military dispute on American soil is unavoidable in, let's say, 10 years. And to seize the moment, just try to do your own faction, if I were Trump, and look into the future. And as I said before, Baron I could be a monarch, not exactly of the whole United States, because maybe because I'm a European, or maybe just because I don't care. I don't necessarily see United States. I don't necessarily see United States as the entity as it is today. There could be a monarchy, like just in the middle of what today is United States, that would be a part of kingdom of whatever would they call themselves, and Baron Trump would be the first monarch to rule them, and he could be 50, 60 years old. But what would lead to that would be a military conflict to solve the problems that are here, like a Gordian knot. You have to chop it. You don't discuss. You don't go into endless debates about what's going on when there are opposing forces on the street, destroying your cities, looting, burning, killing your people, if I may say. So the people that support you are being killed. What you have to do is become a protector. And that's how you become a ruler.
Well, you see, the thing I think what we will see in my country, I suspect, I hope I'm wrong. Everything I'm saying, incidentally, in terms of predictions about my country, be assured, I hope I'm wrong. I hope if I'm around for my 70th birthday, we can laugh at how ridiculous I was. I really hope that's the case.
Or maybe we can celebrate the new monarchy.
I don't really think we're going to get a monarchy in the States. Although I wrote a book talking about such a possibility. I highly doubt it's going to happen. What I think is more likely is that we'll have a Cromwell. We'll have a strong man. And I suspect he'll be wrapped in the flag and he'll lift high the cross, but without a corpus probably. And from that point on, everything will depend upon what his personality is. To the degree that he's good, the degree that he's bad, the degree that he's sane, the degree that he's nuts, the degree that he's smart, the degree that he's stupid. It'll all depend on that. And since I can't pretend any knowledge at all as to who this gentleman might be, I'll just say that he would combine the political savvy of a Huey Long, probably with a uniform. And it's not something I look forward to, because the problem with that system, as opposed to a real monarchy, the problem is that there's no control. Everything is whatever pops out of the guy's head. You know, he might be Franco, he might be Napoleon, he might be Hitler. He could be anything at all. You see, one of the important things about traditional monarchy is precisely the fact, as you said earlier, that they are not free agents, really. They can't do anything they want. They too are as bound up as much as anyone else. And you know, taking St. Thomas as example for a moment, he, following Aristotle, he pointed out that there are three sorts of good government and three sorts of bad. They're like the evil twins, you might say, of the three forms of good. So monarchy, rule of a monarch who rules his people for their own good, etc. Tyranny. Aristocracy, rule by the best people in society. Oligarchy, ruled by the wealthiest and most powerful for their own ends. And lastly, but not leastly, what was called polity, which basically meant rule by the majority of the stakeholders, landowners, veterans, people like that, people who were actually involved with the maintenance of the state. The majority of them versus what he called democracy, which was just mob rule by the masses. And so he said, well, the best, of course, would include elements of each. And in the medieval monarchy, they attempted to do just that, because you had the king, you had the estates of the realm, which encompassed the church, the nobles, and the commoners, who were stakeholders. They weren't everybody. They were landowners and craftsmen and so on and so on. All right. What neither he nor Aristotle ever foresaw was that we could have a mixed government that would include all three of the worst: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, all at the same time. He never, ever, ever came up with that scenario. But in truth, this is what we have. And what, in my country, I suspect, let's just put it this way, we've got at least as good a chance that a strong man would make things worse as better. And getting there would be none of the fun. But in Europe and certain other places, you do have a past you can not necessarily repeat, but you can pull things out of. I'm going to give you one example, if I may. Looking at the Habsburgs, of course. The idea of Austria-Hungary coming back as it was in 1914 it's not going to happen. But the idea of the little nations of Central Europe in a loose confederation under Habsburg, able to resist, shall we say, certain influences from both West and East, that's a whole other kettle of wax. That's not beyond the realm of possibility. Especially because, on the one hand, some sort of reunion for Central Europe, in my humble opinion, is absolutely essential if your countries are going to survive. But on the other hand, the national divisions and hatreds are so strong that you need something or someone capable of transcending them. And in traditional monarchy, and certainly with the Habsburgs, it was the altar and the throne, the faith and the dynasty. I've written a book, A Life of Kaiser Karl, that just came out, and it's now slowly becoming available in Europe. But one of the things that struck me was how so much of the time, both of Karl and of Franz Josef, was given to trying to balance the needs and the complaints and the annoyances of their different nationalities. And you read the correspondence that they would have with, say, Poles and Ukrainians, or Croats and Magyars, or Slovaks and Magyars. Just tell you what, it would drive me to distraction, but somehow they managed to do it. And that is a talent that you don't pick up as a politician. Politicians, you see, have to appeal to envy and to what's worst in us. They have to, because that's the only way they can get people really, really excited about them. Whereas a monarch could say, your fathers and mine stood together. You and me will stand together. Your sons and my sons one day will stand together. Now that's a positive thing, you see, not a negative thing. Because the monarch has it in him, if he chooses, to mobilize what's best in his people. Whereas all the politician can do, as I say, is go for need and envy and greed. How much of political campaigning are promises for stuff or appeals to hatred? Those two things, greed and hatred, envy. And that's not, and I'm not being religious, I'm not being theoretical, I'm not being philosophical. That is simply not how you get the best out of people. You just don't, it doesn't work that way. You look at the police, you look at the military, you look at nurses and doctors, you look at the clergy, you look at any of these sorts of professions you want. We demand selflessness out of them, and we expect them to move for the highest motives and to try to get the highest motives out of us to the degree that we have to interact with them. Why shouldn't leadership be the same way? Why should we be dominated by people whose way of staying in power is by appealing to our very worst, the worst elements in our nature?
Yeah, but that's the problem with democracy, and with what I stated before, because the pool of the voters is so vast that you easily just put out everyone that's for the values that we try to offer and we stand by, us three gentlemen here, and those that are in line of our way of thinking. And you can get like 50-40% of other people that just their entire life it revolves around shopping, enjoying, drinking, having fun, and all the other 7 deadly sins. and you get into parliament.
One would like to say, firstly, I agree with Charles absolutely perfectly about the future of the Middle Europe. So, as Charles said, we can never recreate Austria, the Austrian Empire, as it was in 1914 or 1918. It's impossible, because all those nations which experienced so many different things in the past century, and the development of the way of thinking and the way of being governed could never lead them to have the thing that was before. But on the other hand, as Charles perfectly said. Yes, there is a way. There's a way which is extremely possible, and it is the most perfect way which could exist is a federation of different states, a federation between all the old countries which were the part of the Austrian Empire. Perhaps the forms of those countries would change according to our modern perception of those states now, but that wouldn't be bad by itself, because there is always a natural development in all of those things. So yes, I believe there is an extremely good possibility in a federation of different states of the Middle Europe. Perhaps firstly, what would the first step be would be economical connection between those states, which would quite soon develop into something much more stronger. So we are seeing now, perhaps we're going to return to that quite a bit later, but we are seeing now the reactions of the European Union, which the last few years was governed in an extremely bad manner. I'm not going to judge or comment on the ways that His Excellency President Juncker or Her Excellency Frau van der Leyen are taking the charge of the European Union. But we can see, especially in this year, that those ways of thinking that they can govern European Union are far from being useful. And we can see with Brexit that European Union is far from being eternal and strong and something which cannot be destroyed or which cannot be put as it was before the existence of the European Union. And that's the fact, because slowly in next years, so perhaps even next decades, we are going to experience the fall of influence and power of European Union is going to diminish, because the influence of the other countries, especially now with Turkey, which holds European Union in a checkmate, because we are paying to the Turks an extremely large amount of money, so they keep the illegal immigrants at their borders, and they play with that very card against us. For example, now, last week, I'm this week probably going to film a video, probably in English, about Armenia, because I'm gravely saddened with the things that happened last week, and with that disastrous peace treaty which was signed between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia, which is actually a blessing of all the major states and major powers in the world to bless the new or the continuation of the Armenian genocide, and that's the thing. We are living the history by itself, and we are on the bad side, and that's the problem.
And
so,
we're doing nothing.
We are doing absolutely nothing. So those now is the peaceful now is the Forum de Paix had his meetings in Paris those days, and His Excellency the President of Slovenia, Mr. Pahor, as well addressed other leaders and other members of the Committee of Peace. A very good friend of mine, he's one of the people in charge of the Committee for Peace in Paris. So I do know a bit of the matter. But the saddest thing was we discussed of rather useless things than of real important things which are considered our future. And because, as I said, to govern is to have a clear vision of what one like to do, or what one actions are going to leave consequences for the future. So now we are playing actually like a cat is playing with a mouse, and that's a problem.
But we are the mouse.
And we are the mouse, exactly. But we think we're the cat, and that's the problem, because we think we are almighty, we do everything, we know everything. And very soon, I very sincerely hope, although there are many benefits from the European Union, well, I, as a foreigner in a foreign country, so I benefit from the good part, the good things from the European Union. Like I don't need a visa to study. There was no problems for me to inscribe to university, etc. But there's many other things which are, especially now, showing that they are far from being beneficial.
Tim, hold that thought. Yeah, hold that thought. I just want to jump in. I have two things. So when we're discussing, when you say, both of you said that you don't exactly see the future of rebuilding the Austrian Empire as it was. But then again, maybe because I'm too wild or too stupid or both, I try to think outside of the box and not in terms of etatism as it is now. Because why should we think in terms of federation or confederation if we can think of future Austrian Empire not as it was, but maybe as it could be in the future with the new technologies and knowledge that we had. And the other thing is, when talking about European Union, we have to know that the Union was not built as a political entity, but as a economic cooperation of the European states. And when you're saying things like, I don't need visum to study in Paris as you are at the moment and stuff like that. Well, during the Middle Ages, we didn't need it as well. We started with that thing when the states were brought up, and nationalism. So etatism, nationalism, those are two things that monarchy doesn't know of. And that's just what I wanted to say. Now I leave it up to you.
If you don't mind, I hate to delay you even further, Tim, but I've a couple of thoughts of.
Yeah, well, we're discussing, so no problem.
Also, we've got our friend Rum Punch here. Has asked for the Austro-Hungarian unification. What are the benefits of such a union in comparison to the EU? Which is a good question. Let me say this about that, as the politician said back home. Thing to bear in mind, number one, is that the empire probably would not have stayed the way it was anyway. Had Franz Ferdinand become the emperor, he intended to federate Austria. That was his plan, and he had a lot of resistance, especially from the liberals in Hungary, the Tisas, not the conservatives. But that was his plan. Of course, in all likelihood, he would have tried to have loosened the alliance with Germany and ended the Entente Cordiale. But that was Franz Ferdinand. In a sense, the federation of the sort that we're talking about would pick up where he left off. Now, what it would become in the future, because nothing is static in life, what it would become in the future as time went on, that's another issue. Also, I should mention, too, the fact that when Kaiser Karl was dying in Madeira, he repeated on his deathbed that he was suffering that his peoples might come back together. And I can't help but see in the growing cultus of both himself and his wife, servant of God, Empress Zita, something in that way, as more and more people are devoted to them in Czechia and Austria and Hungary and Slovenia and Slovakia and so forth. It should also be borne in mind, too, that the Austro-Hungarian monarchy left its imprint in Romania and Poland and Ukraine and so on. Those areas and those countries that were under the Habsburgs remain very different from the other parts of their countries. Now, I'm not talking about detaching them or anything like that, but you might say they could easily serve as bridges, because they tend to be a bit closer, despite the ethnic question, in mentality and so on, to the Central European states. The EU, of course, has come a long way from where it was. Remember that when it was founded, its three most prominent founders, Schumann, Adenauer, and de Gasperi, at different times have been considered for sainthood. They were Catholic, and they had in mind the EU and European Union as following in the footsteps of Charlemagne. Obviously, it hasn't gone that way, but a Central European Union of the type we're discussing could act both as an example and as a catalyst for the rest of Europe. You know, part of the problem you've got when you talk about Europe is that European values, that phrase that everybody throws around, mean very different things in Western Europe, at least to the leadership in Western Europe, than in Central Europe. In Central Europe, you speak of European values, what are you talking about? You're talking about freedom of speech, you're talking about rule of law, you're talking about the family, the faith, and all this sort of thing. Those are European values to Central Europeans. That's something that all of you, pretty much, except some of the marches in Poland, it's something that all of you really have in common. And it's a precious thing to have in common. But that's not what European values mean to the leadership in Western Europe. To them, it means gender confusion, abortion on command, etc., etc., etc. And so these are two very, very different worldviews. If the European Union as a whole is ever going to get anywhere near back toward its original vision, or at least the vision of its founders, it would need a counterweight to the leadership of France and Germany. And I can't think of any other counterweight except a Central European Union. So in other words, we're talking about something that would be beneficial not just to the countries involved, but to all of Europe. And I'll take it a step further, being an American, it would be of tremendous benefit to the Europe beyond the seas, to my country and Latin America, Australia, and all that. You see, you really are the mother continent. I hate to break the news to everyone, but I'm not speaking an indigenous American tongue. I don't speak Sioux, no Algonquin, no Huron. I speak English, French. Those are European languages. My DNA, almost all European, not entirely. That's true of most Americans. Dare I say, the mental and cultural health of my country is bound up with that of Europe. And so it is to our benefit to see Europe straighten itself out. But I don't see that as happening unless Central Europe, which is the only part of the old continent that has retained anything resembling sanity, pulls itself together in both senses, both politically and emotionally, psychologically, however you want to say it. But that's where I see the benefits of such a union in comparison to EU, to answer Rumpunch's question.
Tim.
So yes, again, I agree with Charles, because we have so many things in common. I'm like, one is extremely glad that one is not the only one with a family or something like that in his mind. So yes, indeed, that's the saddest thing, because European Union, as Alan, you said, it was firstly as union based on economics.
Yeah.
Which slowly, or in other words, quite quickly escalated into something much more political. And we should never forget the role which was played as well by Otto von Habsburg,
yes,
who as well had a august idea of united Europe, which is far from what we are seeing now. And that's the thing. Yes, there are many more beneficial things. Firstly, because European Union, we can see and feel it more and more. It is something which is almost forced, not something which should be natural to us.
Oh.
And that's a problem, you know, because even in the political matters, there is a natural way, some sort of natural, not evolution, but development of things. So there are countries which are culturally and naturally more connected by their history, for example, but that's one of the reasons, by the faith, by the language, by the customs, etc. There's so many different factors. But although they're trying to create some sort of universal ethics and customs, etc., for the European Union, on the other hand, they're trying to do that. They're trying to create an universal, unique European, not a Slovenian, a Frenchman, Spaniard, Italian, Pole, Croatian, etc. But no, we are, or I am European. Although my traditions, my customs, my language, etc., is completely different from someone else from the European Union. And that's the thing, because they're trying to create a false idea of us all being the same thing or creating the same ideas. They're trying to make us, they're trying to make the mold of a perfect European, which cannot exist. And that's the thing. And once one forgets the faith, then there is no more, there's no way that we can be united. Because one forgets about one's faith and traditions, then a majority of things on which we are built as a nation or as a person or as a culture do not exist. So we don't have our foundations. And that's the thing. We cannot enter in their mold. But I think that they're trying to do that by the education, by all that different things. But on the other hand, they're trying to support the minorities. So we have two different, completely opposite ways. One way, complete unification of creation of something which could not exist. And then, on the other hand, support of minorities.
Well, they should stay on path of economics, like in a form of a wider, broader European Council on economical disputes or policies among entities of European continent. I'm not saying states because I'm against states, so I'm saying entities, whatever they should be. And if the European, as it's called, should exist, I think it should exist, as I said, as a council on economical matters between the entities of European continents and nothing else. Because now we see the conservative, for instance, at the moment, the conservatives in the European Parliament are discussing about LGBTQ ideas and how to implement them in the curriculum of schools and education in states of European Union. I mean, this is ridiculous, and it has nothing to do with what European started as, or it should be. And the second problem is with the rulership. It wasn't implemented into foundation of what we know today as European Union and European Council. There was no discussion about leadership and stuff. So, well, for 4 years, or I don't know how many, this state will have the leadership. Then we'll have some general elections about who will be sitting in our offices and in the European Parliament, and that's it.
It's really quite mad. And you brought up Tim Otto von Habsburg, who's a very useful character to look at in this context. I knew him, which was a great joy. And of course, I've studied his thought. A lot of people think that because he abdicated his rights to the throne, though never to Hungary, and not for his son. The thing is that he did what he could with what he had, shall we say, which wasn't much. The Europe he saw, as I say, was something more along the lines of what the original founders of the EEC, the European Economic Community, had in mind. But it was one that would be religious, Christian. It was one that would feature subsidiarity. That's a phrase that they throw around a lot today, but people forget what it really means. Subsidiarity means that you do the most possible choices you can at the lowest possible level, which incidentally, in medieval days and later, they would call local liberties, provincial rights, that kind of thing. The fueros, they call them in the Carlos in Spain, call them. An end to class conflict, class collaboration. You could call that what you like. Guild socialism, corporatism, distributism, solidarism, all these names that they tossed around between the wars. But basically what it means is the idea that the different elements of society should work together as a family. Now, so far, that we call that solidarity in modern Catholic social circles. And you'll always hear about solidarity and subsidiarity. The problem with the two of them by themselves and with nothing else is that they're just hanging there, and there's nothing to defend them against an all-enveloping Brussels. Which brings us to two other points: the altar and the throne, the faith and the monarchical system. Now, Otto wrote a book which I recommend very highly. In French, it's L'idée impériale. In German, it's Reichsidee. It's the imperial idea. It's never been done in English, sadly. But he wrote at great length about the significance of the, and this goes back to the Middle Ages, of the idea of Abendland, of the Occident, of Christendom as a political entity, but a political entity that was very loose. That is the kind of European Union he had in mind. One that would be sufficiently linked to defend Europe and its possessions against outside opposition, but sufficiently loose to allow the peoples of Europe to develop within a Christian European context on their own. And that I think is what's to be striven for. There was just a question just now about how, what about all the states outside Central Europe who feel differently? Well, tell you a little secret, look at my country. The very principles that the United States and Western Europe adopted as European values are destroying us. You see, let me make something plain here. The political crisis in the United States and elsewhere in the West is not really amenable of a political answer because our problems are cultural, that are reflected in our politics, and of course at base they're religious, that are reflected in our culture. You see, that's the way things really are. The religion of a place determines its culture determines its politics. And some things you can solve on a political level, but they're generally very minor or band-aid-like. But the cultural issues and so the religious issues, these are very deep, and ultimately they have to be addressed. Europe has lost its soul, more in Western Europe than in Central Europe. It's lost its faith. It doesn't know what it stands for. It tries to make up for that by eating and drinking, basically. But that's not going to work. And you come along with, you're faced by people, I'm not going to mention, say, the Muslims, but you're faced by people who actually do stand for something and who do have a real belief in their religion and so in their culture and so in their politics. And they'll eat you for breakfast. It's really quite simple. But we in the West have swallowed so much fantasy for so long. We've completely lost touch with reality. And now we are paying for it. But it doesn't have to be this way. And I repeat what I've said. Central Europe could be both an example and a catalyst to reverse these trends. Because, number one, I don't see anybody else who could do it. So, if you're the only ones available, that's kind of it. But the other thing too is that you still have, and I suppose a big part of it is because of your experience under communism. So much of what we're babbling about now, I mean, you've got college kids in America calling for communism. I'd like to take the whole bunch of them and drop them in any major city in Central Europe and see how far they got with that.
Well, don't do it because those cities are doing excellent at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, Warsaw, Prague, etc.
Well, I understand, but I mean, can you imagine dropping these kids in front of a bunch of pensioners who lived under communism?
Yeah, or just take them somewhere in Slovenia, like Velenje or some city that's extremely socialist still.
And just leave them there for a while. Bye, kids. Have a good time. No, I mean, but we've lost that. You've got to remember, it's 30 years since communism fell. And in the West, our educational system is so bad and so stupid that it's the young people have no idea of what communism was like. None. I traveled in Eastern Europe shortly after the wall fell, and I was amazed at the damage to social life and so forth that had happened in so many ways. But that very experience in some ways insulated you, or inoculated you is a better word. A lot of you anyway. I don't include George Soros in that number, but it inoculated a lot of you.
He's from a different background.
But it inoculated a lot of you against precisely the poisons that we're swallowing now. Which is why I repeat, and I'll say it, to the day I die. If there is hope for the rest of us, Central Europe is a big part of it. Hope politically, I mean. Now, mind you, I have French royalist friends who tell me, well, the revolution began here, it has to be put down here. And I say, God bless them, and I hope it happens. But I'm not going to invest my money in it. But of course, by the same token, you remember that when Macron came in, he gave an interesting speech in which he said that France's dilemma was that they killed their king. And that they've had a leadership problem ever since. Kind of an echo of Balzac's, when we murdered the king, we murdered fatherhood.
But, I think we cannot go through discussion about monarchy versus democracy, and especially not about monarchy, if we're not talking about Catholicism and Christ's social kingship and stuff like that. And I've been discussing this topic in few of my shows lately, and I'm going to develop the idea further, and especially the strive to bring back Christ into social life as well. And when we're talking about European monarchy, or when I'm developing the fantasy or idea about Baron the First becoming a United States monarch. It goes on the line of Catholicism. So Trump being this close to becoming a Catholic, with Melania on his side, and with great ties to some very good and also traditionalist priests being by his side. And if not him as a Constantine, it could be passed to Baron, becoming a Catholic, using the momentum as a leader to unite the Americans that would support the Catholic values, if not religion, and just kind of so building the entity of Catholic states together into a monarchy in the United States, being blessed by the Pope, whichever would be at that time, probably something like Pius the 13th or something like that, I don't know, and thus becoming the first monarch and the Catholic monarch as well. I mean, that's my scenario.
Well, see, this goes back to, as I say, politics being dependent on culture, being dependent on religion. My country's problem, of course, is that it's not a Catholic country, and except for certain relatively small areas, never has been.
So was the Rome wasn't as well?
Well, yes, and my point, you're absolutely right. My point is that for the United States, anyway, before we can, let's put it this way, evangelization of the United States is something that Catholic Americans never did. We had sort of a tacit agreement that in return for being accepted, we wouldn't rock the boat. And the apogee of that, or the nadir, if you like, of that kind of Catholicism was the day of my birth, when Kennedy was elected. We had one of our own in the White House. And everything since then has been downhill for us in church and state. I hope it's not my birth that caused that. It could have been. I don't know. I'm not the best judge. But no, the thing is, in a real sense, I've always believed that we are being paid back for the failure of our fathers to try to evangelize my country. Because, you got to bear in mind that for a Catholic in a pagan country, whether it be the United States or India or Japan, how does he really show his patriotism? How does he show he loves his country? Well, first and foremost, by sharing with it his most prized possession. The Romans who converted their country, the empire, did so because they saw it as their civic duty. They loved Rome so much that they didn't just pay her taxes, they fought in her armies. And so long as they weren't expected to worship the emperor, they were the best soldiers he had. And when they were, they died. You remember St. Maurice and the Thundering Legion, and St. George and St. Sebastian, a ton of military saints. Well, they had that kind of love of country, but converting their country was all bound up with it. We Catholic Americans have never felt that way. We'd pay our taxes, we would die for our country. But we never saw converting her as something that was absolutely required by our patriotism. And it's something that we need somehow or other to learn. Because if we don't, the United States as we have known them are doomed. That's a very histrionic thing to say, but I believe it to be true. Now, having said that, if, as and when the country ever does convert, her culture will change and her institutions will change in a good way. I mean, I explored the possibility of conversion from the top in Star Spangled Crown. And I mean, it has happened. That's how Protestant Europe became Protestant.
Yeah.
But yeah, but the problem is that isn't a really good thing. It's not really that long lasting. Ultimately, the conversion has to be deep. Remember, it's easy to wreck. The Protestants did that. You could do that fairly easily. But to build, to construct, it took centuries to make Christendom. It didn't happen overnight, and that wasn't the purpose. Just like it's not as though St. Benedict and his first disciples sat around and said, I know, we'll save European civilization. No, that's not what happened. What happened was they wanted to save their own souls first and follow their vocation. And they did. And the byproduct was that they saved European civilization. So similarly, that is the challenge that faces Catholic Americans. And I believe that if we convert our country, then she'll change in a good direction organically. But we don't have the inheritance that Europeans still have. That's the thing. You've got a base, even in France and Spain and Portugal, you have a base that's not so far gone that you can't appeal to it. It's still there. But with us, outside southern Louisiana and northern New Mexico and a few other, southern Maryland, a few other favorite spots, we don't have that. Good old American whatnot is Lutheran or Methodist or Episcopalian or Congregational. And there really isn't that much there. I mean, it's difficult to understand this, but we are much more the product of the Reformation than Scandinavia or Britain are. Culturally, they're more Catholic than we are. I know that sounds bizarre, but it's true, because there's a lot more left of the Catholic past in Northern Europe than in America, which never had, except in certain areas, a Catholic past. And that's something that people don't really understand. We had tons of Catholic immigrants come over, and they sort of colonized certain areas, but there was nothing coherent or cohesive about it. And I mean, I'll take an example. You know, I'm French Canadian in descent, just in case there was a question or somebody missed out on that. It's true. Fourth generation in the United States. Now, my first party affiliation was Republican. Why was I a Republican? My dad was a Republican. New England French Canadians were always Republican. Why? Well, because the Democrats were Irish. The Irish were the Democrats, we were the Republicans, you see? Makes sense, right? Of course. It does if you're part of the situation, it makes perfect sense. If you're not, it seems crazy. But the point I'm making here is that there was never a cohesive Catholic identity in the United States. We were sort of a federation of ethnic islands with no concept of converting the mainstream at all. The Hilary Belloc, whom you may remember, a great English, Anglo-French Catholic writer of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, he visited the United States in the 1920s, and he said, America's Catholics will either convert their country or be converted by it. Guess what happened? So that's our challenge. The problem we've tried to do, as I did in the book, or as you're suggesting, of trying to graft a Catholic monarchy onto the American body politic, is that it'd be a little bit like the Renaissance fair. I mean, you don't, it wouldn't be organic. And how long-lasting or how stable it would be is another question. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't mind it. I'm not against it. But in terms of it happening, I mean, I had a lot of fun, as you can imagine, doing the same thing, the Star Spangled Crown. I really did. And I'm not saying it's not a worthwhile book, of course. I'll never talk down any of my books. I just don't think that a scenario like the one I outlined is likely. It'd be nice, but not likely. But I repeat, Europe in general, Central Europe in particular, have not gone that far from their roots. With you, it's a question of reviving what you already have. With us, it's a question of building something that for the most part never existed. And that's a crucial difference.
Tim?
Yeah, one was very glad when you use the term the throne and the altar. I'm not sure if you noticed the speech of Right Honorable Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is one of my favorite politicians and who is as well of those examples one would like to follow if one decides to enter the politics, or when one decides to enter the politics. So, because I quite associate my way of thinking with his way of thinking, but putting aside that personal view about him, he is profoundly Catholic, and as you know, he's serving right now as the leader of the House of Commons.
Yes.
So 4 or 5 days ago, he made an extremely lovely speech. Because as you know, like in France, like in Slovenia and some other countries, the access to public worship is forbidden. And this is as well the essential thing, as Charles was just saying, that we are getting away from our roots because of some sort of excuse of a global pandemic, which is present, of course. I'm repeating myself. It is. I'm not I'm not making conspiracy theories. I'm quite aware of the reality. But sometimes I think that our politicians and governments are exaggerating the things and the measures. So Right Honorable Mr. Rees-Mogg used a term which was extremely popular in the Middle Ages, talking about the two swords, which are quoted in Luke 22:38. So we have a temporal sword and a spiritual sword. And as Right Honorable Member of the Parliament said, that those two swords have been a way of discussion and sometimes dispute among the theologians and philosophers in the Middle Ages and even later. So yeah, sometimes the temporal sword, that's the government, that's those who are governing us, the politics we could say today, try to take charge or being more powerful than the spiritual sword. So as you know, the Boniface VIII in 1302 in his bulla Unam Sanctam, which is one of the most important, we can say, in a political sense of way, because there he says that the spiritual sword is superior to temporal sword. And that conception is completely lost today. I know the 1302 is extremely far away. It's for us, it's in some other dimension, some other time, which never existed perhaps for us. But the question of two swords is still very important. And I think even now it's essential, because now we are seeing that the temporal sword is actually usurping a power over the spiritual sword by banning the masses, and as a Right Honourable Member of the Parliament ends the discussion for those who are the faithful. Because I posted the link of the video on my Facebook page. It's just a video, just like 1 minute and something, and we can see that some other members of Parliament who we can see on their faces that they are unfamiliar.
They're smirking.
They're smiling. I said, oh, what he's saying about is something from the Middle Ages. But far from that, because Mr. Rees-Mogg is an extremely intelligent person. Firstly, with extremely good degree, with extremely good moral life, etc., etc. So he's not someone who is stupid and who is in politics just to be in politics, but he really wants to do something for its people. And thank goodness he's Catholic. Even more, he's more traditional Catholic, as many other Catholic politicians, as we are discussing the last week with Alan about Biden and for example, and Nancy Pelosi, etc. So yes, he's one of those real Catholic politics. One of those people really bloody need today. I'm terribly sorry. I'm being quite vulgar right now, but the reality is that we really need strong politicians that will show that two swords can work together, because finally highest authority is immortal, and we are all going to be judged by the higher authority, the God. So when we lost that sense of transcendence, when we lost our idea that one is going to be judged at the very end for what one did in his life, we lost the real sense of duty and moral. I'm again repeating myself from what I'm saying last few weeks, etc. But that's essential, because the connection between the throne and the altar, or the connection between two swords, is essential. And now, when the temporal sword is trying to is blocking our way to participate at the sacrifice of the Holy Mass, like in France or in Slovenia or Ireland, England, etc. For example, today normally I should be participating at a manifestation, protesting against the measures took by the government, about not allowing us to attend the Mass. But the prefect of the police of Paris said no, there'll be no public protests today in Paris. So you probably saw the videos from Friday's protest, and there was another one yesterday. There were peaceful protests, the people kneeling and praying and chanting. They're not Antifa movements going on in Europe or in the States. So they're two different things. And if you don't allow us to have the essential thing as we Catholics need, how do you think that we are going to listen to what you are saying as the government?
Well, you see, here you've hit on something very important, and it cuts two ways, kind of like a sword. The one is that in country after country, state after state, in Europe, the United States, and so on, what the civil powers, and very often the religious power, have shown is that in their minds, there really is no such thing as church and state per se, as though they were equal powers. It's rather state and church, like state and Rotary Club, or state and bar, or state and market. The state is everything, and the church is simply another service. It's like a club or a hangout. It's not that important. It's not essential. Not like abortions, say, which of course continue during the lockdown. We continue to sacrifice infants to Moloch while we ban the true sacrifice. I get it. I understand. I'm sure this will be blessed in special ways. And God help the people responsible. In Austria, it's a little bit different, because here, Chancellor Crux he was very specific that the churches would remain open. It's the Bishops' Conference that has banned masses. So, what are we faced with? We are faced with church and state acting, well, I'll put it to you this way, at the risk of being unkind. It does happen from time to time. I hate that. You know, none of the apostles were elderly, non-binary people. It really is a shame that so many of their successors appear to be. I think we need a different talent pool. I mean this, of course, in the nicest way possible. But we are in a perfect storm. And the thing to bear in mind when you're living through a world historical event, which is what we're doing, in case you were curious, what would it have been like being in World War I or the Great Depression or the Spanish flu pandemic? Now we're finding out. It's like being inside the page of a history book. As I tell my classmates here, think of it, kids. You're getting the memories now that you will be boring your children and grandchildren with for decades. This is going to be great. you're going to be really boring their heads off with this stuff. Well, this is what it's like living through this kind of thing. And unfortunately, there is no leadership. Not real leadership. You have a few voices here and there, a few bishops, a few politicians. But where there is no vision, the people perish. And what we are seeing first and foremost is the rottenness of the liberal democratic order. Top to bottom, beginning to end. In church and state. At every level. Rot, rot, rot. And it's not like it wasn't already there. You said earlier, I think, Tim, that the holes were there. You bet they were. It's just that what Uncle COVID has done for us is revealed everything in sparkling technicolor. Just how deficient, not to say worthless, so much of our leadership is. Now, the question is, what now? When this current crisis is over, a lot of people have to be held to account in church and in state. Although I'm not what you would call a great fan of universal suffrage, to the degree that you can, there ought to be a lot of incumbents losing their spots. You were part of this, really? Now you'll get to find out what unemployment is like. It's great. You'll be one of the people, just like you always said you were. This kind of thing drives me mad, Of course, there's a lot to drive me mad these days, so it's not hard. But seriously, gentlemen, this is what makes the search for alternatives that we've been discussing all the more important. One of the, I touched on this earlier, and I certainly went on to it a great deal in my book, but one of the things that caused me to write Star Spangled Crown, not that that's yet another plug, but my friend Christoph, after he wrote End of Democracy, he posed me what was an observation, but it turned to a challenge. He said, there is not really a unified body of Catholic monarchist doctrine. There are many different Catholic monarchisms, very divided on national lines, but there's not what you would call a single body of doctrine, as it were. Well, it's very true. I thought about that. And one of the things I did in the book was to try to begin looking at that very issue. And that was where, I looked at the Carlists in Spain, I looked at the Miguelists in Portugal, the Jacobites, Legitimists in Hungary and France, and all sorts of groups all over Europe, to try to see what they had in common. And there was an awful lot. They very often weren't in a position to see it themselves because of the national differences. But it goes back to five points that we mentioned earlier. One, the altar. Very, very important, because the faith, as said earlier, there's an animating philosophy for every society. Well, the faith has to be it for ours. It's got to set the standards, give legitimacy to the leadership, and so on. Be the spiritual sword. The second is the throne. And that is a king who reigns as well as rules, but is limited by custom and tradition, by the faith itself. Who gets his legitimacy, his authority, through the faith from God, but is an executive ruler, like the American president in that sense. I've often thought that if our presidency were hereditary, he wouldn't be allowed to do anything more than what's already in the Constitution, because people always tend to suspect an hereditary monarch much more than they do of somebody they elect. They let elected people get away with anything. So there's your altar and throne, and then solidarity, an end to class conflict, all that stuff. Subsidiarity, provincial rights, that was in all of these movements. And lastly, but not leastly, the concept of Christendom, of Abendland. Again, a loose unity hard to define, but as you'll recall, the medieval state was hard to define. We moderns wouldn't call it a government at all. They didn't have a secret police. They didn't have internal revenue. I mean, what kind of a government is that? That can't just randomly beat up its citizens whenever it wants to. That's hardly government. I mean, a government like that couldn't even keep everybody inside on a 24-hour curfew. Oh.
But we would need a very educated historian on topic of medieval everyday life, because I have a sense that most people in medieval Europe didn't really bother with politics as we do nowadays. No, for instance, as one simple worker from, I don't know, from some town in the United States or from a town or a small city from Slovenia is constantly being bothered with what's happening every day, watching the news, typing his thoughts on Facebook and I don't know where, just being important and trying to be almighty politician. Whereas in, that's my perception, in medieval Europe, just people just like did their job during the day. They prayed, they tried to have some free time, some fun, eat what was there, and that's it.
Well, it wasn't. You know, one of the interesting things you mentioned earlier about every class sort of knowing its place. It's interesting that in the Middle Ages, most of the ranks of the learned generally did not come from the nobility. They usually came from the peasantry or the city dwellers. And there's a reason for that. It's because the nobleman's job was to fight, not to read, not to not to do that sort of thing. That's why Abelard was such a peculiar person, because he was a nobleman. And noblemen who went into that kind of war, and St. Thomas Aquinas was another one. He was a nobleman. You found them, but the vast majority of the educated classes were non-noble, and that's because you're a kid in church. Your pastor notices that you're a bit brighter than the rest, tries you on your letters. If you're good with them, up you go to the cathedral school and maybe a university. That was how they got scholars in those days. Mind you, it varied from place to place. It wasn't a routine, Again, there's nothing you could say about the Middle Ages that's always applicable to every place that ever was.
Yeah, there's not like some matrix or something that you can just take and say, oh, it was same in this town. Not even between towns.
No, it would not quarters of towns. I mean, you would have in a number of European cities, the bishop held part of the town, and a count or the guilds or somebody held the other part of the town. You'll see that setup is in Zagreb. But you saw it in Lyon, you saw it in other places. There was no one. The thing about the Middle Ages that's amazing to me is that there was no one size fits all for anything. There was, in some ways, a lot more unity than we're used to, but in other ways, a lot more diversity.
Exactly. So there was that concept of res publica Christiana, res publica, republic, as we say today. It comes from Latin, res publica, the public thing. So, and the fun thing is that majority of the countries are now republics, but have absolutely nothing in common with this particular definition.
No,
because we're talking about, I'll try to return a bit to democracy. And as Charles made an extremely good point with the episcopal, with the bishops of Austria. So we have another example of failed attempt to democratize church by the local bishops' conferences. And we can see in every country, especially during this pontificate, when Pope Francis is trying to put more power into different bishops' conferences, and it's in some sort create a national churches. You probably do know that the Yugoslavian dictator Josip Broz Tito had an idea to create a Yugoslavian church, and he was hoping that Cardinal Stepinac, was that time still Archbishop Stepinac, would be in charge of that church, but Cardinal Stepinac declined that offer, and then he was imprisoned, etc. Created cardinals, and that creation of Cardinal Stepinac, who was created a cardinal when he was at home in his prison. He never came to Rome to get his galero. No, and that point caused the diplomatic rupture between the state of Yugoslavia and Vatican, the Holy See. So putting that aside, so yes, we have now the ideas which were always seen as bad by the Holy See, by the popes, the nationalization of the churches. So you have a national church. We are one Holy Roman Apostolical Church. We are not the Church of the United States, not the Church of Austria, not the Church of Slovenia, not the Church of Bosnia. No, there's only one church, a Roman church. And the problem by trying to democratize the way the church handles and works, it's extremely bad. And even now, only after a few decades of that bad attempt, we can see the fruits which are all rotten by itself. So yes, that's the thing. And then about Res Publica Christiana and republics and democracy, because now when one says republic, very soon one makes idea or connection between republic and democracy, which are not necessarily the things which work together. They can work together. They can work together perfectly, but they're not the essential. One can exist without the other one. So you can have republic without democracy. You have democracy without republic, and that's the thing, because we have some sort of perverse, that would be a strong word, but special view of democracy and republic, which are bind together per se, and that's the only way that we can proceed, because there's the most natural way that we proceed, that we are proceeding, etc., etc., etc. But no, every nation has its own way of being governed. Like, for example, the Russians, they could never be a democracy like some other countries, because they always had a strong government, or that was the Tsar or the Tsar's entourage, or that's the dictator like Lenin or Stalin or other presidents, would you say, of the Soviet Union, or like His Excellency President Putin. They always a strong figure which holds the power in Russia, and the Russians are doing well with that. If you would send a different kind of government, which would not be perhaps naturally in the way for the Russians, that wouldn't work. Like, for example, the French would never work like they do in Russia. That could never be together. No. So talking about the French, for example, when we talked about the king, like for example Louis XIV, who par excellence in all the historical books and the schools and all the students are talking about, yes, he was an absolute king, etc. But the funny thing is that the president of the republic have more powers, is more absolute ruler than Louis XVI, Louis XIV ever was. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's the funniest thing. And that's everything in the name of democracy, in fraternity, liberty, equality, etc. But they're just the expressions which have no real impact on our lives. Although all the French law and constitution are, in theory, based on those three principles: equality, fraternity, and liberty. Of course, in theory, but in practice, in everyday life, we can see those three delusional words or expressions or facts are not working in everyday life.
No.
And that's the thing.
Gentlemen, when you're talking about everyday life, I think you kind of diplomatically avoided the bone that I threw regarding the Christ kingship in everyday life. I'd like to hear more about that, your take on that. Maybe if it's possible in practice, so some practical views about Christ's kingship.
But we saw that Poland, who is one of the last, one could say, strongholds of Christianity and tradition in Europe, and God bless the Poles and the government and the bishops as well. And we can see now that the thing is, with the McCarrick report and other things, that even the two Polish cardinals being accused by the Holy See in the essential moment for the church in Poland, when they should be 100% supported by the Holy See, they are actually scolded by it, because the church in Poland is an extremely important pillar in the Polish history and in the Polish nation as well. And as you know, a few years ago, I think it's almost like 5 years ago, something like that, the Poles dedicated or proclaimed Christ as a king, which is extremely important. Some people say that's only a symbolical gesture, but it's profoundly spiritual. And then we can return back to those two swords. We can see those two swords coming together, temporal and spiritual, both united in Christ the King, who should rule us all. And once when we enthrone Christ as our King, as Benedict XVI very often said, and when he was addressing the European Parliament, etc., he said, return God back to the constitutions of the states. Because in many constitutions, even today, although it's quite ignored, the invocation normally to the Holy Trinity was at the very beginning of the constitution. No. And that actually defined the nation by itself, because you know the constitution is a thing that defines the nation in a politically loyal thing, in a point of view. So the constitution, although it's extremely important piece of document upon which all the laws and all this type of government of the state is based, and if you have God in the constitution by itself, then you already put a value of Christian faith as the importance of that government or that country, and that's extremely important. So the small acts, one would say, the small acts like that of dedicating a country or a diocese or a city or a nation to Christ the King, it's one of the first steps which one nation or a government can take to firstly for the prosperity of one's country, because we always have to bear in mind that the prosperity of nations as well depends on the morals of a nation. And if we don't have a clear morals which are defined by the Christ himself, the prosperities of a nation are extremely bad. And we can see that with all the other European countries, and with the development of modern way of thinking, with the problem of gay movement or LGBT plus Q thing. I don't know. That's the change. Those things every 3 months.
They're just adding the letters.
Exactly, or abortion or other things. As Charles said, our ancestors would be completely shocked by what, for great majority of this world population, we could say not only Europeans but Americans, in all the world, finds that killing a baby, if you don't want to have a baby or just with no other reason, it's morally and publicly acceptable. You are less moral if you decide to keep a baby, because you're like 16 years old, because you're doing foolish things, or because your baby is sick, because the doctor said, yes, we can see perhaps you're going to have some strange disease, but it's better to kill him. Abort it. Of course, it's very it's much nicer to say abort than to kill, of course. It's less shocking.
No.
But that's a big...
Infanticide sounds so cruel.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the euthanasia sounds better than popping grandpa.
Exactly. Or it's extremely sad because all the Catholic leaders are still saying that Ireland is the great pillar of Christian Europe and everything. But no, Ireland became extremely pagan. We can see now they have one of the more open laws about abortion. And
it's true, and I sometimes it's a horrible thing to say, but sometimes I wish that the parents of the foremost proponents of abortion had felt the same way their children did. Then we wouldn't be having the conversation. But the Irish is particularly tragic because only 30% of the population voted against it, 33%. So the irony here, as you know, a great part of the Irish national mythos is their centuries-long struggle with England for freedom. Well, interestingly enough, Sinn Féin, the rabid Irish nationalists in Northern Ireland, when the British Parliament, which was deadlocked over Brexit, managed to pull itself together to push abortion onto Northern Ireland, despite the resistance of the Northern Irish government, the Ulster Scots, the Protestants being very anti-abortion as a rule. Sinn Féin supported the British Parliament putting abortion into Northern Ireland. Now, isn't this lovely? Sinn Féin, the great Irish Republicans, the freedom from the Brits. But, of course, if it's a question of forcing abortion onto the Northern Irish who don't want it, well, then we're all for it.
Well, they're going to defeat the Brits by exterminating themselves.
That'll show them.
I think that's the plan.
Yeah. Whenever one of us are dead, you won't have anything to occupy.
Yeah.
Well, where do we get such men? You've got to laugh, gentlemen, or you'll cry.
But I see it as a plan. It's
a plan. I mean, just because the strategy is ridiculous and garbage doesn't mean it isn't a plan.
And in terms of democracy and politics nowadays, I mean, it might just be as a reality. Like,
this is the thing, I'll tell you, gentlemen, I'm rather older than both of you, so I'm going to let you in on a terrible secret. On successive realizations I had, shall we say, although I'm speaking of my own American rulership, it extends to Western Europe and to those of your own politicians who wish to follow our path, of whom you don't have a shortage. Back in 72, 73, when we brought in abortion, I was 12 years old. And I remember coming to a terrible realization that I was ruled by evil people. I mean, until the Supreme Court suddenly decided that somehow the founding fathers had tucked abortion away into the Constitution, the vast majority of Americans thought that it was murder. There's no question about that. None. And then the 9 old men changed their minds and everything is different. So I realized our rulers are evil. But You know, lots of people have lived under evil rulers and managed to have pleasant enough lives. So I figured, well. Then when I was in college and Jimmy Carter was president, I came to another realization. Well, our leadership was evil, but also insane. Now, well, I'm not saying this to be as a pejorative. And when I say insane, I don't mean they think, you know, they've got delusions of grandeur. What I mean to say is their ideology is more real to them than the realities of governance. It's more important for them, for instance, to have women serving in the army than to win wars. Their ideology is more important, not unlike the Nazis fighting in the Soviet Union. You know, they were greeted by children with flowers, and they were winning. But the government in Berlin insisted on their putting in their racial policies, and before you know it, you had resistance. Their racial policies were more important to them than winning. So in that sense, as with our own leadership, they were insane. They were mad because the picture in their head of the way things should be was more real than the way things were. That's insanity when you're a ruler. And so I thought, all right, well, my masters are evil and they're insane. That's unfortunate, but a lot of people have lived with that. I'm sure I'll manage somehow. Well, then, under Mr. Obama, I came to another terrible realization. The third and last and horrible, most horrible in a sense. And also bear in mind that our leadership aren't static, so they go through their generations the way the rest of us do. The people that ruled when I was a boy are long dead, but their successors and a mindset developing along its own track, because mindsets, ideologies develop the way people do, and they follow a given track, whatever the implicits of that philosophy are. I'd come to the realization that, yeah, they're evil, and yeah, they're insane, but they're also stupid. They really don't know anything, and they've got an arrogant stupidity. You know, you listen to people like Mrs. Pelosi and my own Governor Newsom, of course, Gruesome Newsom, as we like to call him, the future President Harris, and you realize they don't really know anything. They're very stupid people. Now, mind you, in my country anyway, there's been a dumbing down that's gone through several generations. Our schools teach less and less and less and less. What one doesn't realize is that doesn't just affect the plebes. It also affects the rulership. They don't know anything either. The difference is that unlike the plebes, they're arrogant about it. They must know everything because they're in charge. So how could they not know everything? And that, you see, that's the added to the horrific profile of our leadership. I spoke of it a little earlier with regard to what COVID has revealed. They're as bad, I think, as I've said, but they're also evil, insane, and stupid. It is a perfect storm, gentlemen. It is amazing. I mean, as an historian, I'm fascinated. You know, it's just amazing that people this ridiculous could be running the show. But they do. They are. And the thing is, organically, this can't last. It will be replaced by something, I promise you. The problem is what? I would give you a wager that in 10 or 15 years, or maybe 20, the governments of Western Europe may very well be replaced by groups they would consider today fascist. It is up to people who are believers in altar and throne to try to keep that from happening. But the present set of rulership will not last because they can't. They can't keep this up forever. All of their deficiencies and lacks are being horribly revealed to us every day. That's not going to go away when COVID goes away. They're not going to suddenly become bright people. Wow, COVID's gone. I guess my brain's working. That's actually not going to happen that way. They'll be just as stupid, and then something else will come along. And eventually something will happen that they can't handle. And that is when there are both challenges and opportunities. The challenges, of course, are that, how do I put this? If you're constantly saying the people who support normal marriage and family are fascists, you'll create fascists. That's how that happens. And most people, not knowing all that much anyway, will say, well, I guess if that's a fascist, that's what I am. I must be, because I'm in favor of men and women getting married and having kids. So my master says I'm a fascist, so I guess I am one. All you need is a real fascist to come along, and he's already got a recruit. And it's neither the fault of the fascist or the recruit. It's the fault of the leadership that's already in power. So all these things, gentlemen, all these challenges are facing us. And we do not have a leadership class, ultimately, I think, capable of dealing with them. This is why it's so important, I firmly believe, for monarchists, especially in Europe and especially in Central Europe, to think, to plan, to turn what has been a sentiment into a cause, into a reality, that when push comes to shove, will be able to hold its own and with any luck deliver something better than what's happened so far, or that what else will be on order.
I think we're kind of creating that generations as we speak. I mean, I'm not saying we are this generation, but people like us, and especially those that have children, are raising our children in such spirit that they one day just might as well see the moment to turn sentiment into a reality.
No, and also we can't neglect the spiritual element. I mean, we have to talk about Christ the King and the devotion to Kaiser Karl and Kaiserin Zita is extremely important, and it's unitive. One of the things I realized in writing about them for my book, yet another plug. I wish I'd stopped doing that. It's getting tiresome. But the thing is that Karl had a very European vision, as did Franz Ferdinand, which I had no idea before I started doing my research. It's also interesting that, gee willikers.
Where did that come from?
Was that a plug? Wow. The sad thing is that some people, because of the way the cover looks, they thought, you don't look at all like that, Charles. No, I don't. That's not me. But at any rate, the thing is, a very good picture of him, though.
You're not Charles of Austria. You're Charles in Austria. Yeah,
exactly. And I do feel blessed to be here. That's there's no doubt about that. But so it all makes sense. And I've got the double eagle on the wall, so that's also. But seriously, Zita was quite amazing in her own right. And as a descendant and close relation of the Miguelis Braganzas from Portugal, and the Carlists of Spain, the Comte de Chambord in France, she epitomized in herself all that was best in Western European monarchism. And marrying a Habsburg, they were a pan-European couple in the best possible sense of that term. It really didn't get better. It's interesting that I haven't been able to get there because of the successive lockdowns. But in your own country, the Comte de Chambord and the last two kings of France are entombed.
Exactly.
Well, I'm sorry?
Yes, exactly, yes.
And I haven't gotten there yet. I plan to. My dream trip is to go down there to Gorica and then to Trieste. And it's just a question of lighting. Well, I mean, I've got to wait for the borders to open and the lockdown again. But I'm looking forward very much to doing that. But they actually lived, Chambord lived not too far from here in a place called Frosdorf. And the chateau still has the French royal arms over the door. And there's still a lot of French descendants living in the town because there were, when he was there, they had them living there. So it's fascinating the way the whole thing is interrelated. And that too comes back to another important thing about both the altar and the throne. They are unitive. They they provide a unity for Europe that without, you're forced to make structures to enforce. If you see what I mean. Instead of Aachen, you have Brussels. Instead of Rome, you have Strasbourg. I don't know. I give up. Anyway, I've been on a tear. Someone interrupt me.
I'll just interrupt with this.
Oh. I'm sorry. Was that another shameless plug?
Yeah. Well, I just ordered 3 of your books for your birthday, so that was my gift to you. And I'm just really excited to get them. So I don't have to read E. Michael Jones all the time because his books are this thick and it's really exhausting. I hope the ones that I order are at least this thick.
No, they're thinner. Also, you got to bear in mind that I was a comedian before I was a writer. And I'm only too aware of the fact that you could be watching TV instead of reading my books. So I do try to make them fairly lively.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. Because then, on the other hand, I myself and a few of the gentlemen from Scutum Fide just took up a project of translating Christus Vincit from Bishop Schneider into Slovenian. And that's why I have so many ideas, because now that I'm reading it for the second, third time and translating everything is coming back. So, and especially because I see the need for Christ's kingship in our society. I mean, this is such an essential topic for me. I could talk about this day and night, and it must be exhausting for my wife. I apologize to her.
Yeah. It's a worthwhile topic. You know, you asked earlier, how do you put the kingship of Christ into functioning in your own life? And the truth is, there are a lot of ways. I mean, as you said earlier, Tim, about the consecration of countries, dioceses, provinces, cities, to Christ the King, to the Sacred Heart, to the Immaculate Heart. But you know, you can do that with your home. The enthronement of the Sacred Heart is a very important ceremony. The enthronement of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The Queenship of Mary comes along the Kingship of Christ. You can do it by making sure that you celebrate the seasons of the church year in your home. And if you have children, bring them up on that. And one of the, especially with Christmas coming up, one of the ways that one can really do this in a religiously mixed society is always to send out religious Christmas cards, even to non-Catholic friends. Because very often that's the only chance in a year you'll get to profess the faith in front of some people. And the other thing, are parties. I don't just mean any kind of party, but when you have celebrations for different church holidays, or baptisms and confirmations and things like that, make sure to invite your non-Catholic friends, because they want to know what it's all about. If you have a party for your kid's baptism, and you invite the Lutheran guy who works with you or the atheist or whatever, He's going to want to know all about baptism because he wants to know what your kids, what the whole thing's about. So you can proselytize without appearing to proselytize. You're informing.
Well, what I see a problem in today's society, I was thinking about it the other day, is that we're actually back at the beginning. People have no clue about what Christianity is, what Catholic faith is.
No.
They think they know on what they heard from news and from the internet.
Fratelli tutti.
Yeah, well, I mean, they don't read that. It's 270 pages, but everybody thinks they know everything about Christianity based on completely misleading and even lying facts or information. And I think that,
just a short intermezzo. The saddest thing is that even Catholics do not know what Catholicism is, and that's the problem, which caused all other different confusions. So if you don't know what your faith is, how can you instruct someone about it or defend your faith?
Well, it kind of came to my mind because when you say invite him, he'll be interested about what baptism is. I think it's that difficult because everybody thinks they know what baptism is. So why should I go, oh, that's that boring thing. Oh, they put the baby in the water and hold him down for 2 minutes, or I don't know what they're thinking about. But they are sure to their core, they know what baptism is. They know what Holy Mass is. Everybody thinks they know what everything is. And I see here the opportunity for Catholic tradition, so for Catholics, to prove them wrong, to show them you have absolutely no idea what baptism, because my wife and I, from the beginning of our common path, we were under the banner of traditional sacraments. So our marriage was the first traditional marriage in 60 years in Slovenia and stuff like that. And both of our children now were baptized in the traditional rite. And when everyone came from the family and everyone invited, they were just like, and they're Christian, most of them. And they were just like, what's going on? What's their exorcism? Why is he putting his thumb in the baby's mouth? What's happening? Or on baby's ears and stuff like that. And he put saliva on it. They were just shocked.
Yeah. And that's one of the great things about the traditional rites of the church, is that if you're not used to them, they, shall we say, invite comment, which is good. I mean, one of the things about them is that they were intended to instruct. We forget that. To give you one example, the Old Rite of Baptism is very interesting because if you look at the Latin, the priest addresses the infant or the adult in 3 different ways. At the beginning of the baptismal ceremony, he calls the child creatura, creature, which is the same thing he uses if he's blessing salt or bread or anything else. Oh, thou creature of salt, thou creature of water, etc. Because the infant, spiritually speaking, is just a child of earth. That's the one. But then, after the creed's been recited and the salt's been put in the mouth and the saliva and all that sort of stuff is done, he refers to the child as plasmata, which is a weird word. And it means sort of formed one. Now you see the child is no longer simply a child of earth, but because the baptism hasn't happened yet, not yet a child of God. After the water is applied, and only then, does he call the kid Filius Dei. And that, there's a world of instruction there about what baptism is, why we have it. the difference between fallen mankind and redeemed mankind, all because of a little water being sprinkled. So, but it goes back to what you said, though, Tim. You do have to know this stuff, or you can't share it. You can't be a reservoir if you have no water. So, we do really have to study up on this. It's not like it's all that easy to find out anymore, especially because so many priests don't know, even with the best will in the world. One thing I've learned here, and I'm teaching online, I'm teaching a history course for a seminary back in the States. And that is that our high schools teach nothing. The kids, they don't know the most basic facts of history and literature and so on. So, I mean, this is what I referred to earlier about the dumbing down that even afflicted our leaders. Well, it afflicts everybody. And we're given the tremendous challenge of having to reverse it in every aspect of our lives. You see, because we're all products of our time too, But there's the old joke. You know how you eat an elephant, don't you? One mouthful at a time. You don't want to swallow the whole thing. Trust me on this. And that's how it is with all this sort of thing. Whether you're talking about your faith, whether you're talking about the monarchy, whether you're talking about traditional arts and crafts, it all goes to doing what you can, where you can, as you can. But you have to have the realization that you've got to do it. That's something that we all have to find for ourselves. It's not something that
one podcast at a time.
Well, if it does the trick.
So maybe to finish.
Yeah,
that was the third book. That was the third book I bought.
Vicars of Christ. Well, I'll tell you, it's one of my favorite children. Yeah. The funny thing about this book, I reread a little while ago what I'd written about the current Holy Father. Boy, I knew what I was talking about.
What, is he already in the book?
Oh, yeah,
I didn't see when it was published.
This is the second edition. It came out in 2014 or 15.
Perfect. I think I decided for a great pick.
Oh, it's a thick book. Yeah, it's a thick book, but it'll take you from St. Peter to Francis.
Yeah, I don't mind. I find it interesting. So yeah, I just wanted to brag about the 3 books that I ordered.
It's a funny thing, gentlemen, being here in Central Europe, having just turned 60. It's being surrounded by college-age students. The whole thing is very peculiar. I'm very much aware of the passage of time, but I do feel that there is something moving here in Central Europe. Something positive, I hope. Please God, folks will show the rest of us the necessary path.
If we will pray enough. The rosary, that's the weapon for our time.
Well, while you're mentioning this, I'm going to show you something which I have to recommend very highly. No, it's not mine. It's not mine, but it is a plug. It's this.
Oh, okay. Is that sort of a passport or?
No, it is.
Forgebetsdiga. Oh, it's a prayer book.
But look at what language it's in.
Is it Croatian?
No. It's English.
Okay. Is that a first?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's another Kaiser Karol prayer book like it anywhere. We Americans came up with it first. It's very popular in my country. We've just had the 15th or 16th shrine to him opened up, and another one is on the way.
Well, see, this is what I'm talking about. America being the second Rome, and I think Donald Trump just as might be the second Constantine. And don't resist that idea too much. Just embrace it.
My biggest problem with it is that he and Boris Johnson are the same barber. I find that very difficult.
We all have the same barber.
Well, yeah, it's called lockdown.
I don't know. My wife does mine, so I think she does a pretty good job.
I've got a priest that does mine here. He does everybody's.
Gentlemen, I think we've come to the end of today's show, and I say this too often, and I think every time that we should hear each other as soon as possible. So I'll say it again, and I think we'll sit down before the Christmas. It's going to be a good debate, and it was today as well. So I really like to thank you guys. Maybe both of you some final words, and then we'll say goodbye to the viewers and to each other.
Tim, you're the Parisian.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Charles. So I would just like to repeat, as Charles said at the end, that there is something positive moving in Central Europe, but in Europe in general. And we have really have to, I repeat again myself, but it's extremely important to bear that in mind, that we need our faith and hope. And so with those two weapons, we will very easily gain this war, because we are in war for a very long time for now. And one is of opinion that this actual crisis of COVID-19, which is now just reflecting all other problems we were facing, which were more or less hidden in European and in the world society. Hopefully we'll be able to heal them, and or if some things cannot be fixed or restored, then we should build on that something much more spiritual, again returning to those two swords. So if an institution is not able anymore to cope with the problems or to fulfill its role, then that institution all must be abolished or changed. And yes, we perhaps sometimes we should not be afraid of the change. But I'm not talking about the change in a liberal sense of way, because I'm far from being liberal. But this, like for example, if we see that some institution is keeping us behind, or doing something bad, or is just there to do absolutely nothing, then it's our duty to do something, or to heal it, or to disband it. So yes, I'm not going to enter in more details, but I think if you listen to our conversations, you would quite understand about which institution one is talking. There are so many institutions that have to be changed, reformed, or somehow taken care of. And then I would like to say that we have to pray as well for the temporal sword. We have to pray for good leaders like Blessed Charles was, or like Francis Joseph was as well. So we need leaders with heart and sense of duty. And I believe with hope and prayer, and with the newer generation generations of future politicians, that we can achieve something much greater than our ancestors, the people who are in charge now are doing. So we have to keep our faith and our hopes also in ourselves, because if we want to change the world, we have to start by ourselves. We have to convert others. We have to convert ourselves. I would repeat again, stay positive, because although the situation is grave and the hour is difficult, but we are going to survive this war, and God willing, we're going to be triumphant. Yes, so pray your rosaries, be devoted to our Blessed Lady, be devoted to Saint Michael, Archangel, etc. And pray, of course, especially this month of November, for those souls who are in need of our prayers in purgatory, because more we pray for the dead, more we're going to have lawyers or advocates or supporters for ourselves in heaven afterwards. So pray for the lost souls in purgatory. Pray for those who were close to you. That's very important, and you will have all the spiritual strength you need to face this horrible and absolutely disgusting world we're living in.
I'd agree wholeheartedly. I'd add that this summer, while statues of Columbus and St. Junipero Serra were being torn down in my country, I was not unaware of the fact that in Prague, the Mariensäule, which had been the Marian column, which had been written down in 1918 to show the victory over the both the Catholic altar and the Habsburg throne, was re-erected, and the double eagle went back over the fountain in Prague Castle. Well, some friends of mine who were involved with the effort to rebuild the Radetzky statue in Prague said, well, the Mariensäule has gone up. I guess that's probably the end of any chance we have to get the Radetzky statue. And I said, I wouldn't be so sure if I were you. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, the Prague City Council approved the re-erection of the Radetzky statue. So, as I say, I think of Kaiser Karl's dying words that he was suffering that his peoples might come back together. And thanks to the internet, partly, thanks to people I know otherwise, there are all sorts of reasons for hope, and there always are. You know, when the Roman Empire was falling, there was St. Augustine and St. Ambrose and countless others. So the future, to a great degree, is what we make of it. And we should embrace it, partly because we don't have a choice, and also because we were all of us put here for a given purpose. You know, God didn't suddenly drop us off and say, oh, well, bye-bye. We're here, born in the time and place we were, wherever that time and place was, because God had decided from all eternity this was the best spot for us, A, to save our souls, and B, to help improve the world around us and to help other people save their souls. So be of good cheer. Don't be upset. Do all the reading you got to do. Learn everything you've got to learn. And remember, nothing is written in stone. When I was in college, I went to a military college, and I was trained up with the idea that I was going to die fighting the Soviets in the Fulda Gap. And I believed that quite as thoroughly as I believed I will graduate from this institution. And a bunch of us were raised that way. This was what was going to happen. But it didn't. And one day in 1994, with my best pal, I came driving back from Berlin to his home in Aachen through the Fulda Gap, the very spot where the Soviets would have come, supposedly, had they invaded. And it hit me very hard that of all the terrible things that might yet happen to me, not that. Not that. So God brings good out of evil. He has a plan for each of us. The trick in life is to try to discern that plan. And other than that, Christmas is coming. So cheer up. even if you've got a curfew that's 24 hours and you can't go out and you can't have a tree and you can't go to mass and you can't do anything, thanks to our masters, because we live in a free democratic setup where we're allowed to do everything. We can vote and stuff. Doesn't matter. It's still Christmas. And that, gentlemen, the birth of Christ the King and the Epiphany to come, talk about a royal feast. So, God bless you all, and let's get together before Christmas.
Thank you, both of you gentlemen. I think it was very productive talk. I hope many people will watch it that couldn't watch it now in live. As you said, the Christmas is coming. I think that's the biggest message of what we talked today in almost 3 hours. We should talk more about that. But yeah, anyway, the Advent is first. Maybe we'll have some talk about that. But let's try to use this feast, the church feast of Advent, of preparing ourselves to Christmas. Be joyful, and I think we're still going to put up our trees, and most importantly, we're going to set up our creches. I don't know what other term to use. We call it jaslice in Slovenian. So
nativity scene.
Nativity scene. Yes, of course. I think I used the French word.
Creche,
yeah. So for those Catholics that are watching, and maybe an invitation for those that aren't Catholics as well, to try to bring the season to your homes, set up the creches, the nativity scene, jaslice, set up the trees, decorate them, and but don't try to rush. First, Advent. First, it's Advent. There's darkness, and gradually we come to light with Christ being born. So that's it, gentlemen. Thank you very much again for taking your time. Now we can go into our pajamas. So have a lovely evening, and to everyone that watched us, God bless you. And for conclusion of this topic, let's just make a nice cross in Latin, and that's it. Okay. So, sure. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Amen.
Have a lovely evening, and God bless you, gentlemen.
God bless you all. Good night.
Bye-bye.